Each year in October, Lewis and Clark hosts an environmental symposium. This fall symposium will be entirely online, which gives us the opportunity to include outside experts like yourself. Our theme this year addresses biodiversity conservation, specifically the challenges and opportunities of successfully relating conservation knowledge, whether from scientists, resource managers, indigenous communities, or other sources, and conservation action in terms of law, policy, activism, and management. So I'll ask you a few questions, which you can answer just informally. And then we'll make this video. And so our environmental studies students are going to sort of edit this into, I'm interviewing you and people from New Zealand and Ecuador and Tanzania and Thailand, and then we're going to make it into one session on kind of overseas perspective on this topic that the symposium is about. So it'll be super interesting, and I'll send you more information when all this is kind of put together. So if you're not in the field, you can take a look. So if we can start with you introducing yourself and what you do, you know, up at the gorge, and also what you do for Lewis and Clark. We can start with that.
Okay, so my name is Simon Ling, and I have trained as an ecologist, that's what my undergraduate degree was in, and then I followed that up with much later a master's in forestry and natural resources, which was really education and particularly study abroad. And I've worked with a number of institutions, so including Lewis and Clark, from the US, bringing American students out to look at Australia's history, culture, and of course its natural resources. And in between doing those sorts of things, I run environmental-based tours into one of Queensland's iconic national parks. So it's basically a fairly large sandstone landscape with deep gorges, not of the magnitude of, say, something like the Grand Canyon, but for Australia as such an old weathered continent, it's pretty impressive. And it has permanent water, which is remarkable in the driest inhabited landscape on Earth. And it has a very deep cultural history from an Indigenous perspective as well. So it's a unique location to really look at what Australia's been doing over the last 30 million years, and then what people are doing when they turned up over the last 60,000 years.
Yeah, spending time, just anecdotally, spending time there with you in the gorge was amazing. That your lecture on fire in its place in the you know, the growing cycle of plants and the indigenous handprints on the walls. It was so amazing. I think about it all the time. It was a really amazing experience.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'd like
okay.
to come to the US and do some of that sort of stuff in reverse.
Yeah, that'd be really great. We should talk about that. Okay, so the first question is, can you please briefly introduce one important case of biodiversity conservation in your area to viewers who may not be familiar with it? This may focus on one particular species or habitat. And why is this case significant to you?
Probably the subject that most interests me in the context of biodiversity conservation is really fire. And I guess, so I'm not picking a particular species or a particular habitat, but I'm picking a particular process, which is disturbance, and wanting to talk about its role in terms of biodiversity conservation. And there's a couple of reasons for that. In 2018, in late 2018, we had the hottest fire in my history out at the gorge, and of course in southern Australia this past fire season. So in the 2019-2020 fire season, we've had some of the most catastrophic fires in terms of concentrated effects on environment and wildlife. In living, or sorry, I shouldn't say living memory, but certainly in recorded history. And so that's really the burning issue, for want of a better term, in Australia at the moment, and there's been 2 royal commissions in the last decade and a bit that have focused on our responses to fire and how we should be dealing with fire. And climate change, of course, is throwing us a decent-sized curveball on that front. So the way that we are debating and dealing with fire and the policies that we might evolve in response to the events that we're experiencing, and in trying to incorporate what we might do about that in terms of the shifts in climate that we've already observed and what might be coming, I think is a really important area of discussion, public discussion and research, of course, in Australia. So that 2018 fire, to give you some background, and you'll need to convert some of the units into stuff that makes sense potentially for your audience. But we had a fire that was lit on a grazing property on the southern side of the national park. It was a permitted fire, so that the felder did the right thing, got a permit to burn, failed a few of the permit conditions. They didn't actually follow through as well as should have been done. Lit the thing, didn't go out, moved into the national park, and kept burning for long enough for the environmental conditions to shift into a very bad situation. So when it came down to the gorge, we were experiencing temperatures just under 42 degrees centigrade, which is, I don't know what that is, over 110 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, it's really a lot.
And we were experiencing wind gusts in the open country where the measuring equipment is of up to 70 kilometres per hour. So there's really no pulling up fire in a situation like that. And some of the rangers at Carnarvon Gorge are very, very active in managing fuel loads by using fire. So they've been active in that space for 60 years. And so they're very experienced, and they've got some very good practices with time depth and knowledge that's significant. And some of the areas that they had burnt within the previous 2 to 3 months of that fire burnt again. So they'd reduced the fuel load with management fires, management burns, and those places went up in smoke again when the really hot burn happened. And seeing that occur in the gorge, and then watching what transpired in southern Australia a year later has really made me do a lot more research and learning to try and increase my understanding of fire. Not only from a physical perspective, but where does that fit socially for us? Where does it fit environmentally for us? What are we trying to get out of our management of fire? And how does that sit within what I know about the ecosystems that are present here and how we interact? So that's the area I'd like to address.
Okay, thanks. So how successfully have knowledge and action worked together in this case? What forms of knowledge and action? And can you give an example to illustrate what you've observed?
Yep, all right. So I mentioned earlier about the 2 royal commissions. So the first one that I was talking about there happened after the Black Saturday fires. So this was, I think, 2009. And one of the worst fires in southern Australia's recent histories in terms of deaths. So those fires killed over 170 people in a fairly short space of time and in a very small area. And so the human response to those burns was marked. The psychological impact of those fires is still being felt in those regions today, just because of not all of the things that go with loss of life, but there was lots of loss of property, loss of livestock, and the very environment that drew people into those areas was changed catastrophically during that event as well. So we had a royal commission. You've got a lot of people voicing their opinions, and then you've got experts in the field helping people to figure out what might be done to do things better as time progresses. Now, compared to the 2019-2020 fires, which have become known as the Black Summer fires because they were spread over a very large period of time.
Mm-hmm.
One of the really marked contrasts between those two events is the fact that during this event, where more land went up in very similar types of fires, so these were crown fires moving quickly and over very big areas, only 30-odd people died. So from a human perspective, our practices of getting people prepared and getting people out of the way of these events. Come back to the environmental side of things, the results are a little bit different. So one of the problems that we have had is from the 2009 fires to the Black Summer fires, we knew we had to get better at managing fuel loads. And unfortunately, our systems don't seem to be geared very well to doing that effectively. So one of the problems that we have is the way that we think systematically. If you are a fire manager, you're going to have a window of opportunity for that burn. You've planned it, you've put it on your calendar. During this window, we should be burning this patch, this patch, this patch, and this patch. But if during that window, the environmental conditions are not conducive to a burn, so, it's too hot, it's too windy, whatever it might be, or it could be too wet as well, then you can't pull off that management burn. And because of the way we like scheduling things, it reduces the ability to opportunistically go, the time is right now, let's get out there and burn what we can. So our management processes and strategies actually constrain our ability to manage the fuel loads. And also, you've got a public that's clamouring for fuel loads to be reduced in manners that will adversely affect biodiversity. So one of the key learnings from our fire research is the fact that if you want to increase biodiversity, then the burns should be quite patchy. So you want in an area, and you've got to think about how far plants and animals can travel, in terms of how far seeds can go, how far pollen can go, and how mobile animals are. You've got to think about within their sphere of influence, within a species sphere of influence, you want to have some patches within that area at an appropriate stage of recovery from fire, so recovery from disturbance, for them to be happy and to survive there. So having a mosaic of areas at different stages of recovery from fire, we know facilitates biodiversity, because it means you're giving plants and animals somewhere to go and be, and then when that stage progresses and it's no longer a top spot for them, somewhere else has reached that stage of recovery and they can do well in that area. So one of the big problems with these massive fire events is it resets the entire landscape to the same stage of recovery from fire. So that's a problem. And the fire that we had in 2018 at the Gorge has taught me a lot, because in the last couple of years we've been able to see how that's recovered. And so what happened in the Gorge is a mosaic that had been established and maintained over the last 60 years was reset to ground zero. So to give you a very specific example, this year, so we're 2 winters away from that fire now, there was a massive change in the population of nectar-feeding animals in the Gorge. So in response to the 2018 fire, the eucalypts put a lot of energy into producing seed. And in one of the ways to think about it, and this is a bit anthropomorphic, is that, all right, you've just had this massive disturbance event. the trees are going, well, I may not survive another one if it comes in quick succession. So I'm going to put a ton of resources into reproducing. I'm going to put seed up in the canopy. I'm going to put seed into the seed bank. And then I should have, you know, hedged my bets in case something catastrophic happens and I actually die myself. So all of those resources got dumped into reproduction the following year. And then the year after that, the plants, the major eucalypts that flower in winter in the gorge seem to have gone, well, you know, I need to recover a little bit now and get some more money in the bank. And very, very few of them have flowered, maybe less than 5%. And so the animals that rely on that source of nectar and pollen to get through winter have either starved if they can't move, or if they're mobile like birds, have buggered off somewhere else into places where the flowering is normal. And so that really highlights the risk of having these big fire events that go through and reset the entire landscape to zero. So I've never experienced in 20 years out at the gorge a winter without those honey eaters. And here I am, you know, 21 years in, and for the first time I've seen something that I didn't see before. So from the perspective of biodiversity conservation, that should give you a very clear indicator of what some of the risks are if we can't learn to manage the landscape such that these massive, hot, large-scale fires are mitigated in some way. So questions arising from that you can ask was, well, are we managing the mosaic at too small a scale? Should we be managing that mosaic in a different way? And one of the things that we could do to maybe answer that question is to actually watch how landscapes recover after fire. And the thing I'm thinking of specifically here is, how long does it take you to re-establish the mosaic, given different management approaches as you come? And the gorge offers an opportunity to really have a look at that, because on the gorge floor, which is very accessible, my dog sticking his nose into the frame, not to leave the cat out in the popularity stakes. Thanks, Rufus. So on the gorge floor, the rangers can be very active at managing fire. So they maintain a mosaic very easily there because it's accessible and it's safe for people to be on the ground inputting and performing those management burns. But up above the cliff, it's a very remote landscape, and as a result, they can't stick people in there, because if the fire does something unpredictable, then people are constrained by 200-metre falls, and you could put someone in a situation where they have to make the choice as to a slow death that way or a quick one over the edge. And so up there, we have to manage fire in a very different way, and we can't maintain the mosaic as well. So it would be very interesting to watch how quick it takes to re-establish the mosaic in the upper parts of the landscape versus the lower parts of the landscape. And one of the other, to tie in another thread of the question that you asked, one of the big shifts from the first Royal Commission to this one is that cultural burning, so Indigenous burning practices, have come to the fore as offering a means of managing the landscape in a different way. And that's probably an avenue that I think is worth pursuing, but I am cautious about it. And the reason for that is the continuity of Indigenous practices has been patchy. So in some areas, those practices, the knowledge of what was going on there pre-colonially is not known. We don't know what people were doing because of the amount of change that was forced upon traditional societies. So you can't take someone from an area up north and expect them to be able to transplant directly their practices from semi-arid savanna into wet eucalypt forest.
Yeah.
But what you can look at in terms of Indigenous practices is how they figure out where to burn and when to burn. And the other thing that I am attracted to in their practices is their responsiveness to the vegetation itself. So if you know your patch environmentally, then you can look at the way Indigenous people see the landscape and respond. So it's time to burn when this plant is in this stage. Mm-hmm. So it's telling you that there's enough water. There's, you can use clues from the environment to tell you when the forest is going to do well from the burn. But you need then to be responsive enough as a society to accept that if that's outside the window that you had planned for burning that patch, that it's time to go, and you should have the flexibility to actually do that as the opportunity arises, which at the moment I don't think we're flexible enough to really think about. And the other caveat, I think, on relying, and I'm cautious about relying too much on Indigenous burning practices as a panacea, is really what I'm worried about, is the fact that climate science suggests that we are moving into systems which have no precedent. Right. And if they are unprecedented, then traditional knowledge may be less useful in that category, because the environment is going to be shifting. The distribution, the physiology, a lot of things may respond to shifting climates. But having said that, it's also worth noting that Indigenous people arrived in Australia, and this is from a Western perspective I'm speaking, arrived in Australia around 60,000 years ago, which is well and truly within the last ice age. So from about 13,000 to 9,000 years ago, we transitioned from an ice age to an interglacial. So that across that span of time, the people that were in Australia at that point managed to cope, survive, and thrive to some degree through more climate change than we're currently really thinking about. But the span of those changes was far greater than we think is going to happen now. But that ability to adapt, I think, is also a very useful skill. So I see some great positives from learning about Indigenous practices and being responsive to environment, and also the ability to change. I find the Western approach to environmental management static at times to its detriment. In a country such as Australia with such great climate variation, you see shifts in vegetation across scales of decades, not necessarily scales of centuries or millennia here. And so Indigenous people, having been here for so long, are responsive to those shifts. If you are constrained to one place and you can't move, and the vegetation keeps moving because of climatic change, then you've got no option but to relearn and rethink and work with what's happening. And I think that's a very valuable skill, given the rate of change that we think is coming our way.
And the connection between working with Indigenous people on including their practices, is that coming from the government? Is it coming from rangers who work, or that are different, or is it coming from, like, where is this instigated from?
So it depends on where you are. So there are still landscapes in Australia that are burnt by Indigenous people according to their traditional practices. So particularly in remote areas like Central Australia, West Australia, Northern Australia. And it's in areas of high population where the greatest cultural changes were forced on Indigenous societies. So that's where the knowledge is or lacks the same sort of depth. So it's in those areas that the rebuilding is occurring. So at the moment, we're getting a desire to move in that direction at multiple levels of government. So you're getting people at the community scale, so local government and beneath, actually getting people in as contractors to help them learn. So Indigenous people coming in to help them learn how to burn country. You are getting the cultural groups themselves going to, so in those areas of great, where change has been great, actually teaming up with others, other Indigenous people in different parts of the country to try and rebuild that approach and to then take that knowledge back and apply it to the vegetation, the landscapes and the habitat that they have in their patch. So you're seeing some rebuilding of those processes going on, and you're seeing local councils and rural fire brigades are actually quite open to incorporating some of that knowledge into the way that they do. And so that's a really constructive thing on multiple levels, not just practically, but socially as a country. It's encouraging to see Australians find, and I'm sorry, I'm talking about European Australians, find an area where they can interact with Indigenous knowledge with more respect than I think has been paid in the past. So I think it's a valuable avenue, but I'm still wary about overemphasizing it. I feel it should fit within a broader body of knowledge, and one of the reasons for that is how you manage a landscape with fire depends on what you want from that landscape. If you're managing it for biodiversity, that's a different kettle of fish than managing it for human safety. You're surrounded by communities that are going to put, that need protection. And from an Indigenous perspective, most of the traditional practices were focused on resource maintenance. So, and if those resources are your food sources, or you've got some spiritual reason that you're looking after a resource, that's different from biodiversity conservation management as well. So, you've got to sit down and really think about what you want, how you want to manage that landscape before you can go out and cherry pick the process that you're going to apply. And you also have to understand that, so this is one of the problems that in southern Australia, the forests that drew people to live in them, these tall mountain ash forests. So for those of you that don't know mountain ash, it's the tallest flowering plant in the world. It's skinny, so it doesn't have the mass of the sequoias, the redwoods, but they're almost as tall. And those forests need to die by fire every couple of centuries to actually perpetuate. So you've got this marvelous, magical landscape that has impressed people. Aesthetically, they're beautiful places to be. It's drawn them to it. And then they've realized the potential for fire is off the charts in those landscapes, and are now saying, we need to manage this place by burning it more often. But if you burn it more often than every 200 or 300 years at that intensity, you will lose the actual forest that drew you there in the first place. So, there's antagonism there. And
interesting.
And that's a tough thing to do. And also you've got to then think, well, if those forests existed, they've existed there for the last 65,000 years during Indigenous I guess dominance, because Indigenous people and their burning practices have significant time depth. Then Indigenous people knew that those forests could not be burned with that intensity any more than every 200 or 300 years. The very fact that those forests exist
Right.
tells you by
Right.
default
Yeah.
they haven't
Yeah.
been burning that hard, that frequently. And so this idea that we can take the yearly or the 4 yearly cycles from somewhere else and stick them into a wet eucalypt forest called mountain ash is flawed.
Yeah. Totally different. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the reason for my wariness about uncritically incorporating Indigenous burning practices into biodiversity conservation management practices really comes from that idea. You need to figure out what you're going to manage for, and go from there. And it may prove that some of those forests should not be lived in, or if you're going to live there, you should think of it as Tornado Alley in Australian terms. You need a bunker that's going to save your life when it does go up. If you're going to be there and you're going to stay, because that's what the forest needs to do every so often.
Right.
Is
Right.
burn
It's just baked in. It's baked into the way that it exists. Yeah.
That's right.
Interesting.
That's right, and it's not true up north, because in the southern Australia has a summer dry season and a winter wet season, and then it's the reverse up north. So most of the really horrendous fires occur in southern Australia, because you've got ecosystems that do like to burn, and the dry temperature, the dry times are your hottest times.
Right. Right. Interesting. Okay, so I know I think you might have touched on this a little bit before, but we know that there are many threats to biodiversity around the world, but there may be important opportunities as well. So in this case, in the case of fire, what do you see as the best opportunities for conservation, and what forms of knowledge and/or action would be prioritized?
Yeah, so we have covered a little bit of that already, and I think in terms of education, one of the things that I see as a little bit lacking in my community at the Gorge is a lack of understanding of biodiversity conservation itself. And I guess it comes down to people's economic perspective as well, what it is that you value. So I often hear graziers speaking about fire in a very particular way, and sometimes with a lack of understanding of what rangers are doing and managing a national park. And so they're after fundamentally different outcomes from what they do. And so the antagonism arises because we are stupid enough to think that you can draw a line on a map around a habitat and manage it on one side of that line in a completely different place in a completely different way to the other side of that line.
Right. Like this is a park and this is protected and this is being used for grazing, and so therefore,
Fire doesn't understand that line is there.
Right.
For the animals.
Yeah.
So I see that as one of our pieces of historical baggage that keeps kicking us in the teeth. And Indigenous people didn't really look at the things that way. Right. And so I think, again, we might be able to learn a little bit about being more responsive to that. But also there's the idea of buffer zones. So, from a biodiversity conservation perspective, maybe we need to think about the edges of our national parks or our important biodiversity conservation jurisdictions as being transitional. So you may need to manage that buffer zone in a different way than managing the interior of that reserve. And And in some ways that feeds back into the way we think about reserves. If that's an issue for you, and you need to think about buffering the effects on graziers in both directions. So can we burn that edge area in a way that helps stop plants that are introduced for economic gain coming into our reserve, or reduce the flow of animals that might be impacting, so feral animals that are impacting in either direction, that can happen. But if you're going to take that approach, then edge effects become even more problematic for you. So one of the problems we recognise in biodiversity conservation is, all right, you've got a species there, you've got some habitat, and you go plonk, you've got a reserve. But if that reserve is completely encapsulated by a different land use, like grazing or cropping, then you've boxed that place in, and the effects of what's happening outside your reserve as they travel inside your reserve. If your reserve is below a certain area, you're really not going to have habitats that's unaltered or little altered by the changes that occur on the other side of the boundary. So you need to think about having a bigger reserve so that those edge effects are mitigated, or connecting your reserves with corridors, so that you can still maintain flow in and out, and you've effectively got a bigger reserve that might not be the same jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So, and that leads into an area that's, I think, less focused on fire, but more on general management. And there have been moves in Australia to try and think about that corridor idea and embed it within our production landscapes. So, and this I guess the segue or the connection is really in Indigenous approaches to land use. So Aboriginal people didn't have places where they didn't go, or not in the same way as a national park. So there wasn't a spot where you went and you couldn't do anything really to alter that place. They saw themselves as part of the system, and as a result, managed to work themselves into a very different balance with the environment than we have as inheritors of European culture in Australia. And we're starting to see movements back towards that, which tickles my sense of irony no end, that after 200 years we're starting to think the way that Aboriginal people have thought for millennia, you know.
Right. How about that? They were onto something.
Yeah. And so one of the things that the government has done, and this is really interesting, is offer the ability to put caveats on different parts of your property. So if you're of this mind that some parts, there are going to be parts of your landscape, if you've got a variable landscape, that are less productive than others. And we are learning that if we take those less productive areas and actually try and restore good natural systems, and don't mean you have to try and think about what it was like before humans or before Europeans. You just want a vibrant, diverse community in that area, as diverse as you can. Then if you've got enough of those patches throughout a production landscape, it will work as a corridor for some species, the more mobile species. And we're also finding it has flow-on effects for our production landscape. So, for instance, if you've got some good forest with old-growth timber around an area of a crop, your microbat population, your bird population is much higher, and they actually reduce the pest impacts without the use of insecticide on the crops that you're growing, because they're out there day and night munching on things. And so we are learning that there are beneficial effects from actually doing that. So it can be a win-win situation for people with diverse landscapes. But You know, if your entire property is dead flat, yeah, you got nowhere to move there. So
Right.
it's not going to fit everybody.
Is the government investing in this and like paying people to let their property go fallow, or?
So if you enter into those conservation agreements with the government, they will chuck money at you to fence it off, you know, to keep the stock out of it, and also and also money to help you do your planned burns. So there are benefits that come to you. You get assistance with managing that landscape, but only up to a certain point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, those are interesting opportunities for sure.
Mm. And in terms of fire, at the gorge, I would argue that I think they're doing a very good job. The 2018 fire, despite the fact that it brought everything back to ground zero, is the practices on the gorge floor are up to scratch and doing very well. So one of the pieces of evidence there is up above the floor of the gorge, so up above the cliff line, there were significant areas up there that experienced crown fires. So a crown fire is where you've got the fire transferring up into the canopy, and there's enough heat to actually volatilize all of the, or a significant amount of the oils contained in the eucalypt leaves, and it basically turns into a giant gas fire and can move at great speed. So it's one of the most dangerous types of fires that Australian firefighters experience. So crown fires in a lot of places up above the gorge floor where the rangers don't get direct access, but on the gorge floor, none. So even though it was unprecedented to have that much area burned at one time, certainly within my 20 years there, the disturbance to the forest on the gorge floor was markedly different to the degree of disturbance above. So if you wanted to manage that property, which is very rugged, in the same way, you need more of that.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
A lot of our biodiversity conservation issues just come down to cash.
Yes. I think a lot of places have that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, how do you value it? How do you build economic, or how do you recognise the economic value of having those natural systems? That's when I think our societies, and I'm using the collective term, I think your society has the same issue.
Yes.
How do you figure out what it is? And you can look to other societies for approaches, I guess, and certainly in Australia, you can have a look at how Indigenous people valued the vibrancy of the systems that they lived in. But in modern terms, we would struggle to relate economically to Indigenous people that way. You can have a think about countries like Bhutan, who incorporate as part of their gross national happiness index, forest per capita. Right. So forest per capita is a metaphor for ecosystem services, but we also know it contributes to mental well-being, having these spaces that are largely unaltered by human activity that you can go to and, I don't know, maybe experience the conditions in which humans first evolved, really.
That's super interesting. I love it. Do you have some resources that you can send my way to pass along to the organizers of the symposium that talk about this kind of thing, about fire in relation to biodiversity management?
Yeah, I should be able to drum some stuff up. I just did a ton of research on bushfire history and also outcomes, and we can definitely get hold of the report from the Royal Commission from the 2009 fire, so you can have a look at some of the outcomes there. And the current Royal Commission hasn't produced its full report, but it does have an interim report that's come out, so we can get hold of some of that. and that
Yeah.
might be really good to look at.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be fabulous. I would love that.
Okay.
So if you can pass that along to me whenever you can, but if it can be in the next few days, that'd be awesome.
Well, we're home now, so I'll knock that
Okay.
off while we're, yeah.
Okay, that'd be perfect. I would really appreciate it. And then
Cool.
I'll pass along to you the information on the symposium when I have it available, so you can kind of take a look and see what all this came into.
Yeah, cool. That'd be great.
Awesome. Well, it's great to see you. Great to talk to you. And
Yeah, and you,
I know we'll be in touch about the spring program and next year's programs too. So I look forward to that.